So in this video, I'm just going to give a very brief introduction to some aspects of Second Temple political changes that took place for the uh, Judeans who had been taken from into captivity by the Babylonians up to the time of what we refer to as the Hasmonean period. And I'll save some comments about the um, changes of uh, you know, Judean life during the Roman period for another video. So, going here now with where we begin. We'll start off here with the Persian period. And so this is going from 539 to 331 BCE. So the Babylonians, previously had taken them into captivity. While they are in Babylon, the faith of these Judeans are, developing. They're having to look at lots of different questions that are being raised because they have been punished by God. The warnings of the prophets had come true. They were now in exile. How do they relate to God when they are away from the land, when they don't have a temple? The focus begins to be on listening to God's word, those who may have some knowledge of Torah or the law. And so some of that is developing. But what we then have is the Persian period. So it's going to be under the Persian period where these exiled Judeans are now going to be allowed to return back to the land. So things here, our primary resources for this is First and Second Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah, Esther. Some of the Psalms were written during this period. Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. These are books that are very helpful as we think about how during this period authors writing in Hebrew are recounting the past, recounting their experiences. So our primary political figures during this time, of course, is Cyrus. And then there is Zerubbabel, who's kind of like a governor of the people when they come back to Judea, when they come back to Jerusalem, and Joshua, the high priest. We also have Ezra and Nehemiah, who are people who lead different groups from Babylon back into the land and try to establish some kind of community. Of course, they're under Persian administration. The Persians needed a fortified city in that region because they had political aspirations or political concerns about Egypt to the south, and they wanted a fortified city that would be loyal to Persian administration. But they were giving the Judeans permission to establish their community and their way of life and to build a temple. And so Ezra and Nehemiah are part of that movement. We also have some key developments. We have the rebuilding of the temple, obviously, is pretty important because the presence of the temple is the symbolic representation of God's presence with his people. God dwells within the temple, of course. Judeans would know that God actually dwells in the heavens, but the temple is the place on earth where he makes his dwelling felt or experienced. And so while there is a temple, there is God's favor with his people. Though we don't have a return back to independence, they don't have a king. They have governors. They have people who have to answer to other administrators. Other powers are in charge, but they have made a move forward. And so now with the temple being built, now proper sacrifices can take place because according to the law, you can't offer sacrifices to Yahweh except at the place where God has chosen. And so sacrifices couldn't take place in Babylon. Prayers had to substitute, good deeds had to substitute in the absence of prayer, in the absence of sacrifices. And so, but now sacrifices could be begun again. We also have this break with Samaritans, called Samaritans, and these are people who live in a geographical area. There's, a little bit of mystery about who the Samaritans are, because of a reference in the Chronicles. Some have just thought of Samaritans and used the expression half-breeds because they are a mixture of Assyrian colonists and Israelites from the northern kingdom. That may or may not be the case always. It could very well be that the Samaritans who see themselves as Israelites and who were left, they weren't people who were taken away into exile. And while they were left, they continued to develop a faith, and they have their own kind of Pentateuch. They have some of their practices were very similar to those of those Judeans, but also there are some differences. And so when these Judeans come back and they find these people who have something like their faith, they worship Yahweh, but they have other things that they believe and that they do, and their texts are sometimes different than the Torah that these Judeans are following. And so there becomes a break with them, and they're not permitted to participate in the building of the temple. There's also a dissolution of mixed marriages. By mixed marriages, we mean between Judeans and non-Judeans. So people like Ezra was trying to do this purification reform and seeing these marriages as contaminating, putting in jeopardy the Judeans' ability to worship God or to follow God, because in these mixed marriages, you would have these spouses who, particularly wives, who may be wanting to follow other gods, or who may influence their husbands not to follow their God as they ought, or not being able to bear children that might be somehow or another suspect. They're not Judeans real Judeans, because they're born of a non-Judean. So Ezra says we got to put away our foreign wives. We have a re-emphasis on Torah. So while the temple now is being built, and yes, you'll be able to offer sacrifices, the key thing here is they lost the land, they were put into exile, they lost the temple because they were not obedient to Torah. They weren't obedient to God's law. So there rises, these scribes, these teachers who copy the law, who instruct about the law. And so people who are interpreting the law and wanting to understand what the best way or the correct way of observing the right calendar and the right way in which to offer sacrifices, and the things that every Judean can do in their daily life. Also, we see this rise of the Aramaic language, kind of Semitic language, which has a script very much like Hebrew, but also has a distinctiveness in terms of some of its language and phrases. And we'll begin to see that certain Judeans are going to start using the Aramaic language to write scripture. So parts of Daniel, parts of Esther. We'll see even in the Hebrew Bible, there are sometimes Aramaisms that come through. And so by the time you get to the 1st century AD, 1st century CE, you will then have the language of the common everyday folks is Aramaic. So people are not speaking in Hebrew. Hebrew is the kind of the ancient language of the text, the ancient language of earlier period. So people are now speaking Aramaic. Some major dates then just to keep in mind. So it's around 536, 537, around that period of time that Cyrus is going to allow Jews, Judeans, to return to Jerusalem. It's around 515 that the second temple is completed. Put that maybe in quotes, not really completed, but completed enough. And it's kind of dedicated, so it's kind of seen. So we call this Second Temple Judaism primarily with the destruction of the first temple, but here we have the building of the second temple, and which will get destroyed then in 70 CE by the Romans. And then we have Nehemiah, who comes to Jerusalem around 445, 444, and with that, around that time as well, is Ezra. So the next major period here is the Hellenistic period, going from 331 to 164 BC. Our primary resources is Daniel. So some people might find that surprising that I have Daniel here, because I think of Daniel as stories and events that take place under Babylonian and into Persian period, but I've got it listed here for Hellenistic. That's because the book of Daniel was written during this time, or almost at the end of this time, I think probably around 164, 165 BCE, using legends, stories about a person named Daniel, and also engaging in a new form of communication that we refer to as apocalyptic literature. So these get kind of combined, these narratives that may have had an oral tradition earlier, but now are being composed. Parts, the beginning of Daniel is part in Hebrew, but then it soon will take over in chapter 2 with Aramaic, and then it'll revert back to Hebrew, which is kind of interesting, whether the author is trying to give the book of Daniel a kind of air of kind of classical literature by using the Hebrew language, but clearly indicating their familiarity with Aramaic. So Daniel gives us an idea of how a Judean might be thinking about Judeans' relationship to political powers. So as Daniel is a key character, and how he is able to work in the court of the political power, but how these political powers are also kind of recognizing Israel's God, or Judeans' God, the God of the Jews. And when they do, then they are blessed. And when they don't, then they are brought to an end, because God is not just the God of the Jews, he is the God of all nations, and all nations are under, all rulers are under his control. And the message of Daniel is to stay faithful, to have integrity, while you are living under a political power, which is what, at the time that Daniel was written, they were living under Hellenistic rule, particularly under the rule of one of our key major characters, Antiochus Epiphanes. So you have Daniel as a source. Josephus is a primary source. Now, Josephus was not written during this time, but he was written at the end of the 1st century AD, CE, but he gives us information about this particular time. Of course, we have to read Josephus with a critical eye, because Josephus has his own agenda and the way in which he wants to recount history and tell the story of Judeans for his non-Judean or non-Jewish audience, in order to explain why Jews are behaving in certain ways and what are characteristic about their faith. So we have to look at Josephus and try to collaborate anything that Josephus might claim with other information that we have. But nevertheless, he is a source. The Apocrypha, so these are additional books that were written by Judeans, by Jews during this particular time, and even after this time. And these are books that one might find if someone has like a Roman Catholic Bible, that will have parts of the Apocrypha. Some other Bible, like the New Revised Standard Version, will come along with a an Apocrypha as well. So these are additional books. But again, they were written not in Hebrew, and therefore, you know, may have in a sense of not seeing these in one sense as part of holy scripture amongst Jews. But they had written in Greek and end up becoming a part of the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of Jewish writings of the period. So the Apocrypha is a source that allows us to know what different Jews during this time may have been thinking and their ideas. Also, the pseudepigrapha. Of course, the word pseudepigrapha refers to false writings, not in terms of the ideas or the theology is false, but the idea that these are writings that are ascribed to someone other than who actually wrote it. So, you have, like, for instance, the first Enoch. Well, first Enoch is supposed to be coming from Enoch, who lived before the flood, but he really didn't write that, and so it's falsely ascribed to him, and so also the writings like the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, which is what the sons of Jacob would have written to their descendants, but of course that wasn't really written, by them. So pseudepigrapha refers to a bunch of books that falsely ascribe the authorship of those books to somebody else. The Xenopapyri, this is materials that from this fellow by the name of Zeno, who kind of went through Palestine when it was under the control of one Hellenistic ruler. The Ptolemies ruled in Egypt, and some of his observations about people and life in the land itself during this period. Some key political figures. Reminder: this is during the time of Alexander the Great, so he kind of starts the period. He defeats the Persians, and that's how he ends up taking control of Palestine, of this area. Then, when Alexander the Great dies at a very young age, his empire is broken up amongst his generals. While there are four generals, two are most significant for our understanding of Second Temple Judaism, and that is Ptolemy the First, who ends up getting to run the area of Egypt, and Judea is a part of Egyptian control at one stage, and then Seleucus the First. And there's a complicated history with Seleucus. We'll just say this: that Seleucus eventually comes to acquire control and power over what we would call today Syria, and out into Iran, maybe in as far as Iraq, and maybe as far as Iran. And so he has this kind of northern area, and what's going to end up happening over the next several generations is there going to be the fight for control over Palestine. Sometimes it's going to be under Ptolemaic control, Egyptian control, and then sometimes it's going to be under Seleucus control, or the generations following the Seleucid Empire. So Antiochus Epiphanes, who is the arch villain in the book of Daniel, he is ruling over the Seleucid Empire. So we have then Antiochus IV. So a very interesting, complicated history with Antiochus. Understanding some of that history then allows one to better appreciate the book of Daniel, especially as you get into Daniel chapter 11. Then we have some very important priestly and aristocratic influences in Jerusalem at the time of Antiochus IV. And this is the Tobiats, a wealthy family who seeks political influence, and the Oniats, which are a priestly family who loses the priesthood under Antiochus IV. And so these families, priesthood, are kind of defining and shaping what's taking place in the city towards the end of this stage. Primary developments. We've got some Jews who are being moved to Alexandria. Not all Jews, of course, but when the Ptolemies are in control, and as people see economic opportunities, or as people are being taken to be like slaves in Egypt, or find some reason to move to that area. They moved to Alexandria. Alexandria is on the coast. Of course, the name Alexandria indicating that it was named after Alexander the Great. But we find that a very sizable Jewish population develops in Alexandria. We also see the writing of the Septuagint, this Greek translation, kind of commissioned by the Ptolemies, to when they were wanting to have a library, a great library in the city, and wanted all the great literatures in the world to be translated, as it were, into Greek. Well, the Jews have their literature, and it gets translated into Greek. And that Septuagint, as it was then copied, and as Greek becomes the language of economy and prosperity, these having copies of the Septuagint, the Jewish literature, in Greek, because people are now speaking primarily in Greek when they are living outside of Palestine. So Jews who move to different areas, who want to read their scriptures, they will become familiar with it through the Septuagint. So you'll find this is very important for those reading the New Testament, because oftentimes when a passage of the Old Testament is quoted by Paul or by some other author, what they are quoting is from the Septuagint. So a knowledge of the Septuagint is very important. And sometimes you'll see the Septuagint referenced when you're reading scholarly articles with the Roman numerals LXX. So it stands for 70, because 70, there's a narrative, a story about the Septuagint and its development, with that said that this translation was done by 70 scribes, 70 copyists, in 70 days. So, of course, it's mythological, but nevertheless, because of that, it's referred to with LXX, but that stands for the Septuagint. We also have a desecration of the temple that's going to occur with Antiochus IV, when after being rebuffed by the Romans, when he wanted to try and move into Egypt. He had gone into Egypt earlier, but he wanted to go back in again, but was prevented because the Ptolemies had petitioned the Romans to intervene, and they did, and they basically told Antiochus, don't go any farther. And on his way back, he's upset, and he needs money, and he's going to loot the Jewish temple, and he's been fighting resistance or his Hellenization process by Jews in Jerusalem, and he's fed up with it, and so he's now going to take over the temple, and he's going to dedicate it to a god, basically a god of his mercenaries. Antiochus uses mercenaries, and he dedicates it to one of their gods. And so now sacrifices are being made in the Jewish temple to this pagan god, and he is eliminating, as it were, Jewish practices. In other words, he doesn't want Jews to practice circumcisions anymore. He doesn't want them observing the Sabbath. He wants them to stop their food, um, um, practices. So anyway, that's kind of occurring. And we also have a removal of the Zadokite priesthood. So if you're familiar with the Psalms, you may be familiar with Zadok, the high priest, during the time of David. And so a person is supposed to be a high priest who comes from that line. So, of course, all priests are from the tribe of Levite, but high priests are coming from Aaron. But at the time of David, they're coming through the line of a person by the name of Zadok. And so high priests up to that time claimed this relationship, their ancestry through to Zadok. But at the time of Antiochus, Antiochus sees the high priest as a political figure. Certainly he is, and one who helps him in his Hellenization process. And so he needs a high priest who will basically do his bidding, and he then gives the high priesthood to people who basically purchase it. And so the high priest now becomes people who are not from the Zadokite line. And so there is going to be turmoil at the temple because of all of this. And so this is a major kind of step. So what we really see is people who become high priests, who are not from this line. And the last period we're going to just look at here is the Hasmonean period. So this is from 164 to 63 BCE. So our primary resources again is Daniel. It's kind of a bridge for that. We're moving from that, so a portion of Daniel would be helpful. Again, Josephus, not written during this time, but written after, who talks about this period. Again, part of the Apocrypha, and again, some of the pseudepigrapha is written during this. Our major political figures is again Antiochus IV. So Antiochus IV is going to end up being killed while one of his campaigns, not long after the start of this period. But we call this the Hasmonean or the Maccabean period because of a family that ends up resisting Antiochus Epiphanes and who calls other Judeans to resist this. And so this family, basically from a father, his name is Mattathias, who, according to the legend, according to the story, resists from a time when Antiochus has sent a representative to his little village and called everybody to come together to start making sacrifices to Antiochus's god, and Mattathias resists, and from that point on, they begin to attack, engage in warfare, guerrilla warfare with Antiochus's army. One of his sons, Judas Maccabeus, I believe it's his third son, so we get this period, Maccabean period, after this son's nickname. So Maccabeus is the hammerer. That's what it means. And so it refers to his tactics in guerrilla warfare and his effectiveness in guerrilla warfare. To have a hammer is in order to hammer his opponents, and the way in which he was able to do that effectively. Then John Hyrcanus. So this is one of the rulers. So they end up resisting enough Antiochus. So Antiochus then grants them, as it were, a quasi-independence. All right. So you can continue on practicing your faith. I'm not going to worry with you anymore. Antiochus has other battles that he has to fight on other fronts, plus some internal division within his empire. So he doesn't have the manpower to keep going after these rebellious Jews. So he allows them, you can have your temple, you can have your little area, but just keep paying the taxes, which they agree to. So they have a kind of religious theocratic area. They'll pay their taxes to Antiochus, but now they're going to start having kind of this independent state And so one of the rulers is going to be John Hyrcanus, and he is going to expand the area that Jews are in. So he's going to end up taking land, as it were, from the Seleucid empires. Antiochus is gone. Next rulers arise, but he is successful at acquiring geography around him, such as Samaria, and he's going to move into other portions and acquire this land and make all of this a part of their kingdom. Not really a kingdom, but a part of their domain. We also see during this period the rise of groups that have become very interested for the New Testament, particularly, is Pharisees and Sadducees. We also see the rise of a queen, Salome Alexander, who is going to rule just kind of at the end. And we also see the rise of an Idumean. Idumean is a particular area around Judea who is going to broker a deal with the Romans to end an internal conflict between Salome Alexander's two sons. Each one is kind of a high priest, and one is like the head of the military, but they fight for control. Civil war kind of breaks out. Antipater tries to make the right alignments and brings the Romans basically to end the civil war and to exert their own power. He is rewarded then by having his sons take administrative positions under the Romans in order to oversee what takes place in these areas. So we will just kind of leave those political figures there. The last thing I'll just say here is about political developments. We do have a temple rededication, obviously, after the Maccabees win their battles, take over Jerusalem. They have it. They can rededicate the temple now. It's no longer serving a pagan god. They have this kind of religious political freedom. We also have the development of the Qumran community. So sometime during this period, there are some priests who don't like what's going on with the priesthood and don't like as well what's happening with the Maccabeans, who have taken over the priesthood and who aren't of the line of Zadokites, but they are nevertheless being called the high priest. And they're not following the law as some priests think the law should be followed. So they go out and develop this kind of community, waiting for God's intervention, as it were, to rid the land of wicked priesthoods who are serving, as it were, the political empires and waiting for a Messiah, and who will establish the right kind of priesthood and the right kind of temple sacrifices and follow the right kind of calendar. So the Qumran community, who then are responsible for the writing of what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I said as well, we have this kind of territorial expansion that will take place. So we'll leave that as just a very brief, quick introduction to some aspects of Second Temple political history that you should need to be aware of.